Hello and welcome to today's interview. Today we're joined by Dame Sara Thornton, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, responsible for encouraging good practice in the prevention and detection of modern slavery and the identification of victims. She was the first chair of the National Police Chiefs Council from 2015 to 19, and Dame Sara brings a wealth of experience to this role with a long career with both Thames Valley and Metropolitan Police Service. We're also joined today by Malcolm Harrison, Group CEO of CIPS. Welcome to you both today.
Thank you.
So, Dame Sara, you're just over a year into the role. What have you been focusing on in this time?
So the law that sets out responsibilities in my role, which you explained very well in terms of encouraging good practice, also says that I should have a strategic plan which has to be laid before Parliament by the Home Secretary. That happened last year, and we've been focusing on 4 priorities. The first one is about the support for victims and survivors, really, really important. The second priority is about law enforcement and prosecution. It's really important that traffickers are brought to justice, because very often they see the rewards as high and the risks as low. We need to reverse that. The third priority is about prevention, and I try to shift the focus onto prevention, and this is where the world of procurement and supply chains very much fits in. And our last priority is about research and making sure that all the research is really focused on solving the problems that policymakers and practitioners are faced with. It's really important that we have a good understanding about what works in the sector.
And what have been your biggest observations during this time?
So if I can kind of use those 4 headings, in terms of support for victims, I've been really impressed by the work of charities, lots of different organisations and NGOs providing really good, caring support for victims. I worry enormously about how long they're waiting for decisions to be made about their status as victims, and I really hope the Home Office will improve that. But I guess in terms of victims, my greatest concern is the way in which we help them to become survivors, how we can ensure that they have the right educational opportunities, maybe work opportunities, that they have housing, so that we can really help them to live lives of sustainable independence, which you and I might take for granted. In terms of prosecuting offences, it struck me that there's a lot of police investigations going on, many more than 2 or 3 years ago. But we're not really converting those into prosecutions. The numbers of prosecutions are creeping up, but they're nowhere near sufficient in my view. And in particular, prosecutions under Section 1 and 2 of the Modern Slavery Act have actually been going down rather than up, and that's a really concern for me. In terms of prevention, you know, the whole requirement for companies with a turnover of more than £36 million a year operating in this country to have a modern slavery statement is something where, you know, my view is the bar is quite low. It's set quite low in legislation. Compliance has been improving, which is good, but I do believe that the independent review last year said that the standards need to be sort of toughened up and the sanctions need to be toughened up, and I would agree with that. I don't think a modern slavery statement is the be-all and end-all, but I think it's a first step. But what I've also been trying to do is work with other organisations which are really thinking about what it means to be ethical in terms of business. What does it mean to think about people and planet as much as profit? I'm very much involved in the work that the British Academy has been doing on the future of corporations, and all the sort of work thinking about actually how is business run, and particularly in terms of the broader sense of stakeholders, not just shareholders, but the people who work in businesses, the communities that are affected by their activity, and of course consumers. And then lastly, in terms of research, we've done published a report, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, which is trying to bridge the world of research and universities and policy and practice. So to bring those 2 cultures together so that we really can learn about what's effective, particularly around supporting victims and survivors.
Excellent. So it's just a year on from Operation Fort, like the largest modern slavery case to go through the British courts. What were your findings around this case?
So maybe it'd be helpful if I give a little bit of background. This was a substantial investigation and prosecution. It took about 5 years. And it's my view that these investigations and prosecutions are so expensive, they're complex, they're complicated. And so once they've been successful, it's really important that we look at exactly how an organised crime group infiltrated tier one of supply chains for all the main supermarkets and DIY stores. Because in many ways, they've done an awful lot more than other businesses to try and make themselves resilient against these sorts of activities, but even they were caught. So what we did after the case was concluded, I wrote to all of those businesses and said, look, in the light of this case, what are you doing to make sure this never happens again? What are you doing to build resilience in your organisation, to protect it, to prevent this from happening again? And that led to many conversations, meetings, visits. We looked at all their modern slavery statements, and we were then able to produce a report, which we published in June, and we looked at what was kind of the very best practice in companies down to those that were barely compliant. And we developed what we call a maturity framework, and if people haven't seen it, it's worth having a look at it. And also I put out 4 challenges to chief executive officers saying, are you really celebrating those who raise these issues? How are you treating the whistleblowers? Are you welcoming them? To what extent are you factoring the cost of labour into your thinking about procurement? To what extent is executive pay rewarded by what they do about these important issues? And then lastly, if you are doing inspections and audits, can you make sure that sometimes they're unannounced so that the place doesn't smell of fresh paint when people arrive?
Yes, quite. So what are the implications for business? Malcolm, how do you think, what learnings can we draw from these cases and how businesses manage their supply chains?
Look, I think for me the most important learning is that even where you've got very reputable companies and reputable companies who've put a lot of focus into ensuring that they have got the right supply chains in place and they are taking the right actions to eliminate heinous practices like modern day slavery, this case found that it was still there. So, even despite the best intentions and some of the best businesses, you've still got the issue out there, which I think to me just shows how important it is. And for me, it's really clear that this has to be the responsibility of the buyers. It has to be the responsibility of the people that are taking these sourcing decisions and who are managing these supply chains. And you can't pretend or claim that it's somebody else's responsibility. And Emma, it's perhaps particularly true if you're working in a consumer environment and you realize that your consumers are actually going to take a decision about whether they're going to buy your products or not, based in a large part on how well you're managing that supply chain. So for me, this is an absolutely critical issue and we have to put more focus on really getting to grips with it.
Yeah, that would be my biggest learning, that this case shows that no supply chain is safe from criminal exploitation. There's 2 sorts of models with labour exploitation. Sometimes you have the employer model, maybe in a hand car wash or a cheap nail bar, where the employer is actually doing the exploitation. In these cases, the employer wasn't exploiting. It was somebody else outside who was controlling and coercing maybe up to 400 victims. And as you say, a lot of these businesses, very reputable companies, have done a lot of work, probably are the market leaders, and yet still they were susceptible. And I completely agree. This isn't an issue for somebody sitting at headquarters in corporate social responsibility. This is what buyers are doing in procurement on a day-to-day basis. So this is why it's great for me to have the opportunity to speak to your colleagues today.
Excellent. And also the recent COVID crisis has put a spotlight and strain on supply chains like we've never seen before. And we hope that buyers will take this opportunity to refocus their supply chains more on resilience than cost. However, with increased demand and labour shortages, there has been some examples of exploitation, and I guess it creates the perfect storm and environment for exploiters to take up these opportunities. Have you been aware of more cases during these times?
I think the obvious example to talk about is what's been happening in the textile industry, and of course Leicester is the place that's been in the news, but there are also issues about the textile industry in Manchester and London, so we shouldn't just pick on Leicester. But what you've got there is a really good example where quite a lot of the businesses slowed down, some of them closed down. They then started off very gently, very cautiously. They were doing social distancing. They were making sure that their workers were safe. yet other factories were clearly running hot. You know, they were producing vast volumes of material, and clearly not paying much attention to the health and safety of their workers. And there's stories and rumours that people who fell ill were forced into work. There were issues about whether people had been furloughed and then forced into work. And I think that's kind of brought to everybody's attention the sorts of things that can happen, and COVID really has highlighted that. And it seems to me that businesses that don't care about minimum wages, don't care about proper contracts, actually don't care either about the health and well-being of their employees. And that's been very obvious, I think, and led to a tremendously uneven playing field. I mean, you know, a lot of the time businesses will say to me, you know, the playing field is not level. But I think the sense is during COVID that the lack of level has increased substantially. It's become even more uneven. And so I think that's kind of brought it to the attention of people, and I hope that that might lead to some change. The second thing I think that we have seen in terms of the pandemic is the way in which it can create new vulnerabilities. So maybe people who've lost their jobs, who aren't eligible for state support, you know, are really desperate. And in their desperation will feel that exploitative work is the best option for them. Or indeed businesses which are really struggling to get back on their feet might feel tempted to cut corners. So that's one of the reasons why during the last few months, I've convened several meetings where we've brought together people from the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority, from the trade unions, from the NGOs and workers groups, to make it absolutely clear that the GLAA are out doing their licensing visits, are out responding to intelligence. It's not true to say that during COVID they've all been staying at home. They have actually been going out there and doing their job, because we want to make sure that people know that yes, there are regulations and that they will be enforced where appropriate, even during a pandemic.
And Malcolm, do you see a shift change in supply chains post COVID-19? Do you think there would be a more of a focus on resilience and looking into situations such as modern slavery?
I think there should always be a focus on things like modern slavery. There should always be a focus on ethics. There should always be a focus on sustainability. And I don't think that should change as a result of COVID-19. Where I do think you're going to see a change, though, is I do think people are going to be focusing much more on resilience. And perhaps really focusing on value, which is what good procurement supply professionals should always have focused on, rather than on cost. And I think we've seen an excessive focus in cost over recent years. And I think some of that's been exposed through COVID-19, where you've had some organizations that have suddenly discovered that their sole source, very low cost supplier, couldn't deliver them anything. And then they've got a far bigger problem. And I think you should always remember that the most responsible organizations are always thinking about value, and they're thinking about resilience. And they'll very often choose suppliers not just because of their price, but because of their agility and because of their responsiveness. So I think you are going to see more of that focus around proper value, around resilience, and what I would sincerely hope is that will reinforce the importance of a focus on practices like high integrity, like ensuring that ethics are always adhered to, and certainly ensuring that we're continuing to eliminate and eradicate modern day slavery wherever it might be.
Thanks. And despite these major prosecutions and in fact the most recent exploitation news stories in Leicester, I think it's still yet to have the consumer drive behind this issue and a big campaign. And to quote you, Sarah, slavery is yet to have its blue planet moment. Why do you think this is that?
I think it's it hasn't had the kind of that kind of David Attenborough signal event. Maybe the Leicester thing, is raising awareness, and I think consumer awareness is utterly essential. And that sense in which if there's a bargain which is too good to be true, that might well be because its price is based on the exploitation of another human being. And just for us to all think about that as we purchase goods and services, I think it's really, really important. And of course, the the section 54, the transparency and supply chain aspect of the Modern Slavery Act, was based on an assumption that consumers and civil society would kind of put pressure on business. It wasn't about lots of regulation. It was an idea that liberal society debates and campaigns would push consumer activity and consumer approaches. And probably at the end of the day, that is the best way. I mean, I think that's better that we have people wanting to do the right thing rather than lots of regulation and rules and laws. But I think we haven't quite got there. As I say, maybe what's happening now might prove to be that tipping point.
And Malcolm, do you think businesses still have that focus yet, that they're concerned that they're being exposed will have a major impact on people buying their goods and services?
I think that's a really good question, in particular at a time like this. I'd like to be able to say yes, and I'm sure that for the better and stronger businesses that is the case. However, you've got a time when a lot of businesses, as a result of COVID-19, are under extreme financial pressure, much greater than they have been for a very long time. And I think some businesses are going to be faced with some really, really tough decisions in terms of how do they ensure their survival, and at the same time, how do they ensure that they are complying with the right moral and ethical practices. And I think I would agree entirely with what Dame Sara was saying, that you can't totally control this by regulation. You ultimately have to get to a place where the consumer is voting with their feet or voting with their wallet and saying, well, I'm just not prepared to buy products which are not ethically produced and not ethically sourced. And I do think we're going to see some challenges given the likely recession and likely impact on people's personal and business finances.
Yeah.
Somebody was saying to me the other day that we've managed without hand car washes and cheap nail bars during lockdown. You know, maybe that's something that we should change in terms of our behaviour, because we know those models often include quite substantial levels of exploitation. So why go back to it? We've managed without it perfectly well. Why go back to it? Because we know that people in hand car washes are not paid the minimum wage, that their health and safety is disregarded, that there's all sorts of environmental agency violations. So why not change our behaviour?
Yeah. So I think we are going to see changes in consumer behaviour. I think we are going to see changes in lifestyle. And I would hope that part of that is going to be a greater focus on ensuring that people are buying things which are ethically produced and sourced.
And Malcolm, procurement professionals are at the coalface on this issue, and you know, most of the addressing the issues in their supply chains. How is CIPS supporting procurement professionals to eradicate modern slavery in their supply chains?
So CIPS exists to improve the capability of the profession and to make sure that procurement professionals have the right skills to be able to address these issues. And there are really three areas that we have focused on. One is all around ethics, and it's ensuring that people properly understand what the right ethics are. And we've done a lot of work with the Home Office in the UK to produce an ethics training package, which is now available to CIPS members. And in fact, the government, we're trying to roll it out as widely as we can. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we've done a lot of work on awareness, ensuring that we highlight the issues around modern day slavery and how it might occur. And then I think thirdly, you know, we've launched this program on how do you train people to be more aware of the issues around modern day slavery in supply chains. And importantly, that program, it's as much about how do you detect and how do you eradicate, how do you work with suppliers to be able to not only find the issues, but then get rid of the issues. And critically within that, we will say to organizations, think not just about your first tier suppliers, but think about the depth of your supply chains. Think about contractors, subcontractors, and also sometimes think about how you solve these issues, which might actually be collaboration, might even be collaboration with your competitors in order to eradicate an issue like this. So look at the apparel industry. You know, I will always be of the view that great apparel sells itself to a consumer based on its appeal, based on its design, based on its texture, not based on whether or not there's modern day slavery in that. There should be no modern day slavery, and I would advocate that competitors should be collaborating in areas like this to elaborate practices such as modern day slavery.
Excellent. How do we keep up the momentum then given the recent Operation Fort and the Leicester issue, how do we make sure this is kept to the forefront of businesses' mind? Dame Sarah, do you want to go first?
Of course. So maybe I pick up on what Malcolm was saying about procurement professionals being utterly central to this. When we talk about training, for example, we will say that the procurement professionals are absolutely a priority for training in organisations. And I think that point about supply chains, business will often be clearer about their tier 1 supply chains, but we think they should be going to tier 2, 3, 4, 5. And the best businesses are at least kind of aware down to 3. Places like Marks and Spencer's, they've got their kind of map on their modern slavery statement, which is really good, focusing on where the supply chains are. Because we know, for example, in textiles, that what will happen is the order will be placed with tier 1. Tier 1 will then turn around to its subcontractors and effectively hold an auction and say, guys, how much can you make this dress for, or these pair of jogging bottoms, or whatever it is. And that's where people go away and they kind of offer the lowest price, and it's just not doable. And so, I don't want to teach professionals how to do their job, but, those sorts of basic questions about how can this product have been made, given the cost of materials and labour? How can this factory have, produced 100,000 items, when actually to do that, given the size of the factory, it would have to be, operating 24/7, and that's just not legal. So kind of asking those sorts of questions and asking them down the supply chain, I think is really, really important. And also what we find is that when we looked at, what are the best companies doing, they're not abandoning suppliers at the first sign of trouble. This sense in which you kind of cascade ethical standards. Do you work with suppliers to help them to improve, to work with them rather than abandoning them? And I think the point that Malcolm makes about collaboration is really important. Where you see that kind of dark side to the business, it's very often about kind of creating that sense of competition, which actually is very unhelpful, pitting companies against each other. And I think, a lot of the people I've spoken to have said that there could be a lot more collaboration in the pre-competitive space, whether it's in textiles or food or whatever the business is.
Absolutely, absolutely. And finally, what's coming up next then, Dame Sarah, for you and your team?
Well, we're doing a lot of work at the moment about how we support child victims of modern slavery, and we'll be publishing a report on that next month. We're also doing some work on how you protect victims of modern slavery who are also being accused of criminal offences, and that's a report for September. I want to do a lot more work on financial institutions, not just investors, because I think investors have got a really important role to play in putting pressure on boards to do the right thing about everything we're talking about, but also about banks and who they're lending to and what questions they're asking. Of course, the issue about Leicester has raised some really important policy debates. For example, we have transparency in supply chains. The EU is now looking at having legislation on human rights due diligence, and that will be a really interesting debate. It will affect the UK. Of course, we're not in the EU, but of course those issues about whether we need to go beyond transparency in supply chains, really important questions to be talking about. I also heard Harriet Harman at the weekend was talking about the idea that she'd first put in the human rights report of the Joint Committee of Parliament about making businesses legally accountable for all the human rights abuses in their supply chain. Some might say, how can you be made accountable for things you can't control? Others might say, well, you should have better control. So that's a really interesting debate. There's also been talk about whether the textile industry or hand car washes should be part of the licensing regime that the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority look after. At the moment, it's just agriculture, horticulture, shellfish and packaging, but should it be increased? And lastly, and I think something which could be a game changer is the proposed single enforcement body, which would bring together the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority, the bit of HMRC that looks after minimum wage enforcement, and lastly, the bit of the business department, which looks after employment agencies. And maybe that could really drive change and enforcement based locally and make a real difference.
Excellent stuff. Well, that draws us to a close. So thank you both very much. Just to pick out a few points, it's great to hear that compliance is on the rise. There's obviously a great more that businesses can do, and hopefully we'll be able to keep that momentum going. Collaboration seems to be key to success for this, so I'd really encourage businesses to reach out to people within their sectors and work together on that. Have those open, transparent relationships with their suppliers, and as you say, Dame Sarah, celebrate and encourage detection and whistleblowers. And hopefully we'll start to see some great results. We'll put our CIPS resources in the comments on this video, but thank you both very much for your time today.
Thank you.